The type of writing that might seem to be the most familiar to students who come into an undergraduate degree is writing to learn. Writing to learn is the practice of articulating in your own words your thoughts regarding matter, regarding content that you have just come across. That might mean that you have read something and you are writing down its argument, you're writing down the main points in order to make sure that you understood them. That might mean that you sat in a lecture, that someone talked to you about something that you were previously unfamiliar with, something about which you want to deepen your knowledge, and you write down the things that stayed with you and you're trying to connect once again all the steps that the person has taken in their speech in order to make sure that they remain. Learning theories have shown us again and again across disciplines that if one is a passive learner, a passive listener in a process of engagement, the amount of learning that takes place is minimal. That means, for instance, in our case, that if all you need to do as a person across the screen from us is to listen to Soumya and me talk about our experience, talk about defining different types of writing, by the end of the course, having listened to maybe 5 hours of us speaking, you will remember very little. It's not useless, but it is not making best use of our time. Instead of which, research has shown that once listening takes place, or even at the same time as listening takes place, if this listening is processed, if the information that comes to me is processed and is written down, is re-articulated orally, that information is more likely to be retained. Additionally, if the writing down happens again later on, that information, that knowledge, that thought, the logical connections made are not likely to stay only at the level of our short term memory, but are likely to last longer. Plus, every time I articulate something, something that feels very clear in my head, but the moment I start talking about it is a little bit nebulous, every time I try to say it to you, every time I try to write it down, that act of articulating is forcing me to clarify, is forcing me to ask questions of myself, is forcing me to establish relationships. And this process of establishing relationships is what helps us truly understand the subject that we have engaged with. And that's what helps us take it forward, integrate it into the knowledge that we have had earlier on, and integrate it into the knowledge that we're likely to receive later from a variety of sources. When we ask our students to write in order to learn, we need to remember that many of them come from school systems in which they wrote in order to learn, but the idea of learning was one that involved memorizing. Remember the kind of school and the kind of system where if you did not write down the answer in your exam in the same words in which the teacher dictated it to you would actually not receive the kind of marks that you deserved, right? So, so students who come to college, and this is the case for places like Harvard, for places like Princeton, for places like Berkeley, it's not the case only for universities in India, but students who come to college need to make a jump. They need to realize that at college level, the kind of learning that is expected of them may be of a different kind. It may be that now we have crossed the stage where the most important thing, according to our teachers, is to memorize the information, to make sure that we know the formula, to make sure that we know what we are told. And we are now moving in that hierarchy of learning that we're all familiar with. We're moving towards learning that entails reflection. We're moving towards learning that entails thinking, what we will end up calling critical thinking, even, but not in a loose fashion. We will use that term only as soon as we define it. But the point is, if we want our students to use writing as a tool to help them learn, we will have to give them the tools to do that. We will have to tell them what are the options at their disposal. If my aim is to make sure that the student gets the best out of information that is presented to them, either by a live speaker or through a text or through a video recording or from a documentary, then what I do is to introduce various systems to take notes, and I facilitate the process of them practicing, of them turning the habit of taking notes like that into something that's almost second nature, that they don't have to focus on, they don't have to devote time to. Now, to just introduce a note taking system to students is not enough. What we need to do is to then guide them, make sure that we go through a couple of samples, point out what's going right, what's going wrong. What a system like this enables a tutor to do is to identify who are the students in a classroom who are struggling and what they're struggling with. Are the students struggling to understand because perhaps we're moving from one point to the next too fast, or because they can't find the time to write notes in between? Are they struggling to understand connections, which can maybe then be re emphasized while the students are told how to pick on them through verbal cues? Are they struggling to jot it down briefly and to indicate links between the points that they've noted down? So, as soon as we're able to tell a student that you're capturing this, but you're not capturing that, you need to pay more attention to this, they will be able to implement it in the next round of note taking. Writing of this kind, like any kind of writing, is a process that takes time. It takes a while to develop the habit to do it. And unless we ask the students to do it repeatedly, unless we make it into a meaningful system for which they receive feedback, it is very difficult for the system, for this new thing to benefit everyone. Another way to ask our students to write in order to learn is a little bit more complex, and it entails a little bit more feedback from us as faculty, but I consider it to be more effective. That entails engaging with material, and at the end of it, whether it is a lecture or a text that they are supposed to be reading, asking themselves not just to take notes but also to reflect on it. This is not a process of making sure that they remember the right things and the right connections, but this is a process of making sure that they're able to integrate the new knowledge that they have received into knowledge that they already had. That means asking them to write something that might be very, very brief, that asks a question such as, how is this topic of the day relevant to what you already knew? How does this, for example, challenge maybe assumptions that you had earlier? How does it challenge the knowledge that you had earlier? How does it add to the knowledge you had earlier? For example, let's imagine a student who is listening to the housing struggles that migrant workers to a city like Ahmedabad face. Perhaps as a student of urban planning or of design, they have been used to thinking about housing as a problem of numbers, as a problem of accommodating a huge number of people on limited land that is very, very expensive. But to listen to the struggle of people who migrated, who perhaps do not have the documents, who do not have the resources to buy land or to rent housing, people who face discrimination when they are trying to access rental housing, is to integrate a new perspective into the knowledge that they already had. Now, the approach we take as tutors is very often to say, do you agree or disagree? But in order to agree or disagree to a proposition like this, to a new claim that someone is bringing to you, you have to be able to articulate what your previous position was, what the position of the speaker or the writer is, and you have to articulate where the consonance and where the dissonance between these is. And this is not an easy process. So, very often we are unhappy when the students are able to argue eloquently why they take a particular position without actually realizing that they need time to write and articulate for themselves in order to learn where they stand, in order to learn how to build an opinion based on something that they have received plus the knowledge that they already have. Yet another and a little bit more complex kind of writing to learn that we can introduce to our students is a more summative one. That means it's not taking place only at every step, but it's taking place at the end of a loop in the process. For example, in a course that runs for 12 weeks, perhaps in the first 4 weeks we cover a certain set of concepts. At the end of 4 weeks, we want to figure out what the students know, what they made sense of. We also want to give them an opportunity to think back, to make sure that they actually remember, are able to integrate, are able to apply everything that has been discussed in class, everything that they have reflected on and written in between. This kind of writing very often looks like an essay. It is an essay that is posing a problem, posing a question, asking them to think of, say, four different perspectives and which one of them makes sense or which ones are at odds with each other. It's asking the students to integrate, synthesize, compare, add to the knowledge that they have received and put it together. If we are asking the students to write an essay, we're already introducing a new level of complexity to this exercise. At the same time, it is important for us to remember and to tell the students that this is an essay written to help you learn, which means that it matters for you to articulate your standpoint or your argument or what you are attempting to do. That is important. It means it is important for you to be able to substantiate every claim you make. In conclusion, if our interest is in using writing as a way of engaging with knowledge, which allows our students to process the things that they are learning in a different way, then the kind of time and the kind of marks and the kind of feedback we have to allot to writing have to be particular to this. That kind of writing, writing to learn, should not be overburdened by concerns that belong to other kinds of writing, which we will talk about in the upcoming modules. If we do this, then we are defining very clearly the aim that we have in mind when we decide that writing is the thing we need to ask our students to do. We can also make allowances for students who, for instance, may really not be able to learn through writing. The question for a tutor would then be, what do you do when you are faced with a student who is not in the habit of processing information by writing it down and who instinctively turns it into charts, into drawings, into other ways of organizing the information which works better to them? In such a case, because our focus is not on teaching students a certain genre, which will come in handy for them later on, but the focus is on making sure that they work with that knowledge, they work with that content. Adjustments can be made, allowances can be made for students who may not actually make use of this kind of writing. So there is leeway in there. On the other hand, if the writing was taught for its own sake, an essay for its own sake, it would not be possible to interact with the student and to allow them to submit, say, a mind map, right, which might work to fulfill the aim of learning, but does not work in a similar way to fulfill the aim of articulating. With this in mind, we move on to the next kind of writing that might come in handy for students of design and disciplines of the built environment.